Welcome to the Passive House podcast, brought to you by Passive House Accelerator, a catalyst for zero carbon building. For news, stories and connections from all flavours of Passive House, check out the articles, videos and more at passivehouseaccelerator.com. Sign up to receive regular updates about events, get your technical questions answered and contribute to the community forum, and of course, attend the weekly online Global Passive House Happy Hour. Now, here's this week's Passive House podcast. And welcome back to another Encore episode of the Passive House podcast. I'm Matthew Cutler-Welsh and I'm coming to you from my home here in Auckland, New Zealand. Zach, you're on holiday at the moment?
I am. I'm visiting family in Sunnyvale, California.
And we've also welcoming back today, Mary James. Where are you, Mary?
I am still at home in Larkspur, California.
Nice. And it is summertime for you guys and having a little bit of a break from our regular schedule, but it's a great opportunity to catch up on some of our highlights from the first year of podcasting. And boy, did we have some good highlights. And it's great to have you back with us, Mary, because you and Ilka brought some awesome interviews to us in this first 50 or so episodes, which we're going to have a re-listen to one of those this week. But before we do, we've got some people to thank for bringing us the Passive House podcast.
That's right. Everything we do at Passive House Accelerator comes thanks to our sponsors. And our founding sponsors are 475 High Performance Building Supply, Baxtingui Architects, Glavel Foam Glass Gravel, Minutair All-in-One HVAC and Dehumidification Units, Mitsubishi Electric Train HVAC US, Partel, RDH Building Science, Rockwell North America, Stillcorp, and Zola Windows. Our champion sponsor is SIGA, and our stakeholder partner is NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. So thanks, sponsors.
All right. So this week's Encore episode was episode 37 with Katie Faulkner, who, Mary, you want to give us a reintroduction? Tell us a bit about Katie and why we decided to get her on the show.
So Katie is founder of WestFaulkner, which is based in Boston. It's has as its mission sustainable design, but more importantly, she's also director at PTIG Technologies, which is a division of Placetailor, whose initial focus is on the design and prefabrication of retrofit panels for triple-decker homes. And I'm excited about their progress they've been making on their retrofit panels. And just excited about the concept of getting mass retrofits done, and that there's a company that's focusing on how to get that done more efficiently and involving prefabrication in the process. Now, Katie had some great experience that she's brought to this because she was vice president of design for Katerra, focusing then on mid-rise mass timber housing prototype. But so it's a great episode. Katie has a lot of experience that she gets into with prefabrication and fabrication in general. And like I said, they've been making progress since this episode in what they've been doing with the company. So they're moving forward on their panel design and production. They've gotten some initial funding from Mass Ventures to support them. And they're aligning themselves with a number of other companies that they've been talking to take their idea to production.
Awesome. Well, let's listen in and we'll come back and have a quick update of where things have got to since this episode.
Well, we're really lucky today to have Katie Faulkner with us of WestFaulkner, who is doing some very exciting work with prefab retrofit panels. But along the way, she's done many other exciting endeavors. So we'll get to hear about all of this. Welcome, Katie.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
So in 2010, you were awarded an MBA. And why did you choose to get that degree, to go through that program? And how did that relate to the founding of NADAAA in 2011?
Sure. I'm not sure the two were connected. At least I didn't think so at the time, although everything looks different in hindsight. The idea of getting that MBA, which I'd been doing part-time while I was working at Shepley Bulfinch, was because I had been very focused on project delivery. That was the time when you were starting to see P3 projects and different contracts about integrated project delivery. And I certainly had the ambition of going out and doing something on my own that looked at different ways of delivering a project that would control the amount of waste, whether that would be environmental, whether that would be cost. I just found that the process, particularly at the scale that I was working, which was the large healthcare, was just unimaginable, kind of the complexity of it. I found it frustrating. So that had been the motivator behind the MBA. It took me a couple of years to get it. And so by the time I got out, of course, I felt newly minted and ready to do something. Nader Tirani and I had been good friends in graduate school, and he was in the process of closing a firm that he had with another partner, and had asked me to do some consulting for him in 2010, along with another partner, Dan Gallagher. So the three of us would get together and mostly talk about contracts and building a book of business and how to make sure that the work that Office DA had done could in some way continue. Ultimately, that turned into conversations about an office, and we launched a new firm called NADAAA in January of 2011.
So, and while working there, you were actually involved in a very large CLT project, right?
Yeah. So that was later. So I was with NADAAA for about almost 10 years, for 9 years. And that project is what I would consider to be a kind of a typical NADAAA project. And that what's so great about NADAAA is NADAAA really focused on the process of design through delivery and took a look at the materials and the craft. And that was almost a concept or a schematic design departure. And so when we had the opportunity to do the work for Rhode Island School of Design, we weren't necessarily saying this is going to be a CLT building. We looked at their strategic goals. They are a very mission-driven college, and they are very focused on accessibility and inclusion, and not even just kind of in what we might think about in terms of either physical access or the kind of inclusion that we're talking about now, but on the absolute broadest possible scale. And that really pulled in and a sensibility about the environment. So in looking at the process and developing the program, we're immediately drawn to timber as both a highly durable and appropriate material for artists, because those rooms get a lot of abuse. These artist students really, they do their craft in their rooms. And if you looked at the R+D rooms over the years, you'd see that they're almost monastic in their durability. So timber certainly checked that box, but it also checked the box of a responsibility and a stewardship toward the environment that was very important to the school. Because it was an integrated project delivery contract and the first we'd ever done, we had the opportunity to test drive a ton of cost models and looked at all sorts of building types that might work for what we were after. Ultimately, I think we settled on a 5B, which is a hybrid with a steel frame and the CLT deck and roof. And that is on top of the concrete foundation. So that kind of 5/3 that you sometimes see, that kind of 3-hour first story, that's what we did. And it was groundbreaking at the time. I mean, there wasn't another building like it. We didn't have a precedent to look at least in New England. And I think that NADAA's process of work and prototyping, we do a lot of fabrication and lab work. That's what helped us get to that building. And I think we were all quite excited when it was finally realized.
And did that spark your interest in prefabricated panels?
It did, although I've been very interested in prefabricated panels for a very long time. I mean, as early as graduate school, I had this real fascination with the work of Jean Prouvé in particular, who wasn't actually an architect by training. I think he was more of a metalworker craftsman, but he was he worked in the realm of architecture, and he approached products in terms of how they would be built. He did a lot of furniture. He did a lot of demountable buildings. I think we could argue that these kind of ADUs and tiny houses that we now look at that are being pulled in on sites have their genesis in some of his early prototypes. And I always felt that that kind of design for manufacture would help us streamline the process. So even in other projects and even in other NADAAA projects, we were constantly looking for ways to pull in prefabrication, to create new assemblies and do them in a serial way so that we could use them on the site. Different kinds of wall panels that would be both high performance, but also go up very quickly. We did a project for MIT that had a really extraordinary wall panel. So I think the CLT was probably what pulled me toward my decision that we no longer could work with foam. I think kind of that project to me suddenly said, we can do all of these things with much more sustainable materials. We really don't need to focus on concrete. We really don't need to focus so much on foam. I think that the CLT pulled me into that realm of realizing that there was tremendous potential to do large buildings with a very sustainable material, notably timber.
So, and then in 2019, you actually started working at Katerra.
I did.
So, how did that happen?
So I found out about Katerra in 2015. I think there was this really splashy Wall Street Journal article that a lot of people saw where this one big company came out of the gate saying that they were going to fix construction as it had been broken. McKinsey had come out with a report maybe a few years right around then that had shown that the productivity in other industries in the last however many decades was just a big hockey stick in terms of what technology had done for most industries. And then kind of down there at the bottom in the flat line, you see construction. That had always resonated with me. It had resonated with me in business school. It had resonated with me as an architect. And now here comes this company with the kind of confidence to say, we're going to use Silicon Valley mentality of move fast and break things, and we're going to control the entire supply chain. And oh, by the way, we are building a CLT factory, and we're going to do it in timber. So not only is it going to be incredibly efficient, and will you be able to mitigate risk and certainly have a better sense of cost, but now also we're going to do this with timber. So how's so exciting? So I was actually lobbying them from the get-go. I found out that Craig Curtis, who I knew vaguely from my time working in Seattle, who I'm sure didn't remember me, but was a total nice guy about it, called him up. It was like, hey, Craig. And what I wanted him to do was to hire NADAAA. That what they had been doing is they've been doing some partnerships with architects. They were working with Lears Weinzappel in Boston, who's done some really fine mass timber projects since then, but was probably first out of the gate. They were the first group I knew that was working in Boston in mass timber. I knew they were doing some work with them. They had a number of architectural associations, and I wanted them to work with us as well. I made a real pitch for the fact that we had an arm called NADAAA, that we were doing a lot of timber fabrication, timber prototypes, and both Craig and the CEO, Michael Marks, were nice enough to come visit when they were in the area. And so we were actually invited to join their design consortium, which was great. Kind of fast forward toward the end of the story, and they started actually acquiring some of these firms. They certainly didn't buy Lears Weinzappel, but they did acquire a couple of others, and they started acquiring construction companies. And so this idea of partnering with the architecture firms was less attractive to them. I was offered a position to work with them soon after, and I really struggled with that, but ultimately jumped at it. Again, this idea to have the resources to control the supply chain and take it on from this environmental perspective, to take this crisis that we all know that we're in and we don't really know how to fix it, and put a lot of money and incredibly smart people behind it, was just too tempting. And so I I had the opportunity to work there, and I didn't even work there a year. I think I started in July of 2019, and by April of 2020, here we are in COVID, and I'm still commuting from Boston out to Seattle. And so I was furloughed, but ultimately my whole group disbanded. And so I never went back. And it was kind of crushing, even though it wasn't surprising. I mean, I think what'll happen with them is that we won't hear quite as much about them in the near term in terms of really big timber thinking. They will be quietly building projects, which they are doing all over the country, and kind of streamlining their delivery method. And then I think they will emerge as this kind of construction company that's really got a sense of the supply chain. And I hope that timber remains a part of that, because I think that investment that they made in mass timber is fantastic and has real potential. But stay tuned.
So what was the work that you did do then there during the time you were working there?
I was specifically working on growing the mass timber market. And by that, I mean either working with contractors and developers that had projects that might already have their feasibility studies and their entitlements complete under another construction type, and they were interested to see if it could be done in mass timber. So I did a lot of backing into that pro forma and looking at the designs and reconfiguring those. I also developed a housing mid-rise prototype. So this ubiquitous prototype that we have over the kind of 1 story of concrete deck or 3 stories of concrete deck with 5 stories of stick built, which is very common in, we see these kind of mega block housing projects, maybe more so in the West than we do here on the East, but we still see them, trying to compete with those and to show that we could build a better, more sustainable, more beautiful project by using mass timber. We reconfigured the modules, the structural bays. We designed it to match the manufacturing process. So taking into account the machines that were actually doing the glue lam or making the CLT billets and designing around those so that you'd minimize waste. It's incredibly difficult to compete on cost with stick built, and that certainly depends what part of the country you're in. But I still believe that it's feasible to compete on schedule, that once there are enough people in that market and once the delivery is streamlined enough, it's just so much faster to work in mass timber than it is in these more complex, or I'll say maybe more multi-material construction types. It's still, I don't think we're going to see those popping up anytime soon. I think volumetric modular is going to compete, I think, but it's just tough to beat stick built. And my goal was to try to do that. So I was constantly trying to kind of drive down the cost or drive down the schedule so that we could be on parity with peer projects that were being built under another construction type. It was fascinating work.
And did you become familiar with Passive House at any point during this process?
I did. You definitely can't not be in that mass timber world and not cross paths with the Passive House world. I think while they're not identical, there's a lot of synergy there. And so, and the other thing is that I've never been completely committed to the full-blown mass timber solution, that there's a lot of room for hybrid in my vernacular of mass timber. I think that probably does come out of the work with R+D. It's more important to get to net zero or close to Passive House, in my opinion, than it is to have complete fidelity to the mass timber construction type. So I think I started paying a lot of attention to the Passive House people. I had been familiar with Passive House, I think, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, but Placetailor was a group in Boston that I knew. They launched about the same time as NADAAA. They were in the same neighborhood, so we kind of crossed paths with them. And they had come out right out of the gate in 2010, 2011 saying, we're only going to do Passive House. So here we are kind of working alongside them and watching them with their projects and I was thinking, why aren't we, meaning NADAAA, doing that work? Now, we weren't exactly in that typology. We weren't doing a lot of housing at that time, but it was really interesting to watch them So yeah, I really got an education kind of from afar, but then became much closer to it as we got into mass timber and started dealing with various kinds of certification.
So when you did leave Katerra, you started your own firm, WestFaulkner. Why did you decide to do that?
Well, that was kind of default, I think. I mean, I've always wanted to have my own thing, or at least thought I did, although I found right away how much I dislike working by myself. That was really that suddenly I was so hungry for, any kind of collaboration. I started volunteering for like anything and everything that would get me on a committee. So I also found that I couldn't go back into an office, partially because of Katerra and having had the opportunity to work hand in glove with contractors and engineers, and fabricators. So I had really had this very interesting year of looking at project delivery from a very different perspective. And I think partially because the NADAAA experience was also very hard to replicate. We took fabrication and prototyping to be a big part of our process. And I can't think of another firm that does that to that extent. And I would go in and talk to people, or I guess at that time I was Zoom interviewing, and I just found I couldn't go back to the office. It was hard to explain, but the only option left for me, I felt, was to go out and do my own thing and try to kind of collaborate or, team up with people. So I was at least had the fun of colleagues, but, the freedom to continue to explore some of these things that I really care about.
Can you just elaborate a little bit on the process at NADAAA that you were just describing? Can you give me an example of a project where you included the fabrication elements that you were just talking about?
Yeah, to be perfectly honest, I don't think I can think of a project where we didn't include the fabrication. Now, we didn't always fabricate our own construction, but we did sometimes. So, for example, with the North Hall project at R+D, we took some of when CLT arrives on site, it's often put up in layers, and in between the layers, there's kind of CLT offcuts that are used as almost like dunnage to stop the billets from hitting each other. So we picked up some of that scrap and we used it for some of the interior millwork, and we fabricated all of that ourselves. We did a number of stores. There's Aesop, which makes skincare, Australian-based company that has opened a bunch of stores in the US. And there was a period, I think we did 9 stores for them. And of those, I think 3 of them we built out ourselves. So that was the most extreme, where we would actually have a piece of a project or a project that we could actually build. So we had a pretty good shop. I mean, there were 5,000 square feet of studio upstairs and 5,000 square feet of shop space downstairs. And they still have that. I mean, NADAAA is still a very active part of the firm. When we weren't building our own installations, we were testing in the design phase. So we have this really interesting auditorium at the University of Toronto, which has a bunch of colored wood louvers that are kind of move. They appear as if they're moving. They're not, but it was through a play of CNC shaping the profiles to vary along the long length of the wall and interspersing it with contrasting colors that gives this amazing effect that we had gotten from these kinetic sculptors had been the inspiration. But I mean, just, weeks of testing these things and mocking them up and making sure that they looked appropriate. I mean, anytime we would do almost anything, particularly if it was a new detail for us, we would build it. And we had the good fortune of being it's an old plaster casting showroom and factory. And so the ceilings are incredibly high upstairs in the studio. So you can really build things tall. And then downstairs in the basement, while the ceilings aren't as high, it's a very durable and open space. And so you can build things long. So it's a material fabrication, testing, all of those things are just so fundamental to the process.
So do you feel like prefabrication kind of opens up an opportunity for women getting into the construction industry rather than kind of sticking with architecture?
I do. I think that as I have been practicing over, too long to 30 something or 25 plus years, I have noticed that schools have invested a lot of money in fabrication facilities, and people are starting to graduate with fantastic skills, everything from this kind of parametric modeling to using tools for digitization and computation analysis that produce beautiful objects. And for those first years when I would see this happen, I would kind of wonder what was going to become of this cohort of designers, because I didn't necessarily feel that the field was ready to receive them. Now, I think there are all of these companies that are popping up all over the country that are looking at ways to build things off-site, that are taking these tools that help us move from conceptual to manufacture, that allows it to be done at a scale that can be customized. And I think that's only going to continue. There is no muscular or gender kind of requirement on that. It doesn't necessarily come out of the trades, so you don't need to have the legitimacy of having kind of come up in the trades if you're going to be out there on the site actually building the thing. I think that the whole idea of the kind of modeling and the moving it from the software to realization is gender neutral. So there are definitely other barriers that we have to overcome in terms of attracting the women and getting them in. But I think that it's a tremendous opportunity for people. It opens up all kinds of issues. You can see people doing it, doing it from a variety of locales, because now it's all software based. And so it kind of can come together in one location, but you can pull your talent from lots of places. It can allow people that maybe felt like they had to take time out of the workforce because they, how could you work construction if you had to raise a little kid? I think now that's a game changer. So I think it's huge. And I think it's got some retraining potential as well, but it does feel like a new frontier. I mean, I definitely learn something every day but short answer, yes, I do.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. And it's great that there's all these new opportunities. So you actually started looking at prefabricated retrofit panels, right? Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes. So there's a wonderful competition that was launched in Massachusetts by Mass CEC last summer. And I was really excited about it. At this point, I've had my own office for just a couple of months, dying to dive into a competition. And I see something that's so up my alley in terms of giving the opportunity to pull in prefabrication and kind of alternate project delivery. So, and the premise of the competition looks at the tens of thousands of triple deckers in Massachusetts, which is this ubiquitous 3-story wood frame building type, most of which were built between 1900 and 1930. And it was primarily to house immigrants that were coming in various levels of industry. But if you've talked to anybody who's ever gone to school in Boston or lived here as a new family or a single person or came in, became a new American, oftentimes they'll say they lived in one of these at one point in their life. They're beloved, but they are leaky, they're cold, they're noisy. They're charming, but in that charming way of kind of, an old thing that needs to be fixed. I immediately thought of Placetailor as someone I'd love to partner with, because it didn't require passive house per se, but it was the buildings needed to be electric, and you really did have to evaluate them to passive house criteria. And so a lot of the kind of testing and metrics that had to do with the carbon calculator, it was just really important, I think, to pull passive house into the conversation. So thankfully and amazingly, Colin Booth of Placetailor said, yeah, we'd love to, which was great. So we spent several weeks working on this. We met every week. And my personal interest in it, beyond the passive house and the energy, which is the core of the competition, was trying to crack the business model for this. That in all of our looking in Energy Sprung and all these fantastic other programs that are out there, many of which are in Europe, we in the US are going to have a hard time doing this, because it doesn't necessarily look attractive to a building owner, particularly a building owner of rental housing, that since they're not paying the energy bills anyway, and since they've got so many other expenses, the idea that we would come in and deep energy retrofit their building is not super attractive. We looked at a number of things. We did not think that you could get your money back on the net present value of the future energy savings, at least in a reasonable amount of time. You could certainly get your money back if you were allowed to add on to the building. So if you could get a fourth unit in, the real estate and the added rent helped. But if you could only spend the money that you could spend, the best bang for the buck was a very well-built wall panel, even more important than replacing the windows. That if you could replace the wall panels, if you could get this high insulating envelope on the outside, if you could come in with cellulose on the inside, if you could do your best to seal the leaks, I mean, I'm speaking to the choir because I know you both already know this, that was where the money should be spent. When we began to design the panel and talk about manufacturing the panel and kind of dive down into it, we really struggled to find a non-foam based solution. We looked at hemp, we looked at mushrooms, but it had to be something that we felt like we could get. So in the end, our panel design did have some foam in it. It had the magnesium board, it had some foam in it, and it was what we went forward with. But we left that experience saying that we were going to try to launch what's called a bio-based panel that was an integrated panel that had both the insulation and the siding as one unit, and that it had a high enough R value and was easy enough to install that it could compete with what's out there now. And that's what we've been focusing on. Placetailor is deep into this with me. Evan Smith of Placetailor is my partner in moving this forward. It's been really fun. The funding and is a kind of constant headache. I'm really anxious about trying to get it to the next level and trying to raise some money to do it. But I think it's important. And I think, as we've seen through these passive house discussions and through the accelerator publication that you just pulled out, there's a tremendous amount of interest and talent that are biting at this apple. So I do feel like there's room for people. There's room for more than one entity to kind of come forward with these new products. But we'd really like to develop something that we could bring to market as a highly sustainable retrofit envelope.
And just to be clear, it would not be a structural panel, right?
It wouldn't. That isn't to say that it could not later become a component of a structural panel. But in the retrofit, I don't necessarily need a structural panel. I do have to support the panel itself, and there are issues of wind and in the installation, the panel, obviously if it gets too big. So I had this notion that they would be these big 10 by 20 foot panels, but frankly, the panel's own weight starts to compromise the integrity of the panel. But the building itself, at least in the typology of the triple decker, the building has enough integrity to support that panel. It does need something at the bottom to kind of keep it, in place, but the panel itself is an envelope. So it does have to have its own integrity, but it is not a structural element. We're looking for the building to support the panel. So it has to be very light. I mean, I'm looking at these kind of 4 to 8 pounds a square foot. I mean, you can't put a very heavy panel on these little buildings.
So how about windows? Are they installed?
Yes. So how about, right? It's so
Talk about weight.
No, it's not the weight. It is. No? I mean, I do think the weight is an issue, but in my vision, in my rendering, in our combined competition entry, of course, the panel includes the windows and goes in as an entire unit. We are struggling with that at the moment. It's not clear if it will go in as a unit or if the window needs to be installed after the panel is in place, or vice versa, that the window goes in and the panel goes over it. That I think the necessity to keep the panel really light might mean that it would go in a smaller increment than I had originally envisioned. And so there'll be plain panels and there'll be window panels, and some of those window panels might not actually be integrated solutions. So hopefully we'll talk in 6 months and I'll have this fantastic proof of concept and the windows right in there. But at this point, I don't actually know. It's ideal that it is. We're looking at integrating particular tilt-turn windows, but we have not had success yet.
And you alluded to the difficulty of finding the funding. How are you, what kind of funding are you looking for the development of the prototype panel?
We have written a grant for the Catalyst program, which is a Mass Ventures funded Mass CEC program that does provide some funding for R&D for companies like ours. It's a little bit more geared toward university kind of based projects. In other words, something that has a PI, maybe with an affiliation that is looking to produce a product, but they still allow people like us to participate. So we have that pending, fingers crossed. I am looking at NADAAA to see if we can sort of go in there and see if there's any offerings. Ultimately, I think we would like to have some private investors that are aligned with the mission, that might be willing to ride out the extended period of time it might take to get this to profitability. But I don't think that we can appeal to them until we have panels on a building. You know, we're the advantage to working with Placetailor is that we do have somewhat of a pipeline there, and so in a small situation, we may have the potential to install the panels and really get them ready. They also all have to be tested. So we're trying to, if we were fortunate enough to get the Catalyst grant, frankly, I think we would use the bulk of that funding to take us through the testing that would need to be required on the panel, the wind, fire, moisture mitigation. You know, there's a kind of long list that we think are necessary.
But that is an advantage that you're working with a firm where you have, as you said, projects where you could actually use this. So they have retrofits in mind. And are they?
That's the hope. I mean, as I said, it all. I think everything has to fall into place. I mean, the thinking is that ultimately you don't want to saddle an owner with having to be a live guinea pig for the panel. And so we're pretty far from a situation where I think we feel like we could panelize a building where ultimately the units would all be sold as condos. So we have to kind of think that piece of it through. But at least we have the advantage of getting it up there, even if it isn't permanent. So, during some projects, that would give us some opportunities. It's certainly, Mary, the goal is to get it on one of the buildings that's being developed, because then we've actually not only taken proof of concept, but we've implemented it. But I still think we have to clear the testing. And that's a real learning curve for me. That's all new for me. I'm not used to that world. I'll be calling Ilka, and I already do this when I have questions, what do you think about this? So, it is, it's a new terrain. It's a new frontier.
Yes. Testing and third-party review is definitely something. So you actually introduced me a while back to a group that you're very active in, and it's called the Women's Development Collaboration. Could you talk a little bit about this group and maybe in general what role development has in the future of sustainable building?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I do feel that one of the ingredients to solving this problem that we face in looking at whether it's new housing, retrofit housing, kind of addressing what I consider the kind of morass of design through construction, has something to do with the delivery and the market of it. That, the more something goes through a phase, the more people that are involved, the more cost goes up, the more it's difficult to control. And so I think development is a really key part of solving the problem. And I don't think necessarily that the interests are aligned in development right now with, I think, what we're talking about in the passive house discussions, or even, more broadly in architecture, construction, engineering. And I think that has to change. I also have been generally active, I think, throughout my career in a lot of women's advocacy organizations, both as a mentor and a mentee. So when I saw the Women's Development Collaborative, and the reason I found them was that they were doing a seminar in Toronto where I had a building project with a complete women's owned group. And I'd never even heard of that. Like I didn't know any women in development. And I had planned to go to that, and I had signed up that pre-COVID, and of course that got canceled. So then I kind of found out about the group and wanted to get more involved. And it turned out that it's a pretty small group. Most of them are connected to ULI, but some of them are not. And their real mission is to bring more women into development and to support women developers, to help women better understand what investment in development means and how actually people can do that at a variety of scales. I've spoken before about Eve Picker, who has Small Change, who's really focused on crowdfunding and again, helping people who maybe didn't have the opportunity to invest in development. So I see a real alignment with the WDC, and I've done a few workshops with them on mass timber and this idea of the retrofits, just to talk about that kind of construction. But their mission is a lot broader. I mean, again, they hope to build a fund that helps women with development projects. So they're a really ambitious mission, which is wonderful. It's a great group.
Yeah, that's a great group. So do you think in general, by being involved in these advocacy groups, is that how you've included feminism in your working life?
It is. It's an interesting time to be, I'm in my 50s and I've been practicing for a long time. And of course, we're all at this inflection point when we're woken up to things maybe that we thought were fair and level and now find out that they're not. And this kind of question about being a woman in the field, I've changed the way I feel about it at many different times in my career. I think when I was younger, I was very willing to kind of look the other way and maybe play the game. I mean, I remember distinctly my first job in this training, and really a woman I admire, and I still admire her, but said to me at one point that it was really important to use my skirt as I was kind of trying to navigate the studio and the work environment, et cetera. And I've always remembered that. I remember this absolute moment, but at the time it was said, it was totally normal. Like, yeah, of course, so I've sort of learned to accept things that I thought, this is how it goes, right? You just laugh off certain things that are not appropriate, or maybe there are certain social situations that involve a lot of drinking that maybe you should avoid when it's with colleagues, and et cetera. And so as I've kind of change that, and then sort of standing back where I am now and seeing a younger generation of people kind of stand up and point these things out, I recognize how maybe I've actually been complicit in a system which has provided barriers for others. And so I've been thinking a lot about that. That isn't to say that I have not been a very active women in design person. There are loads. I'm fortunate enough to be in Boston that has a really active professional organization with the Boston Society of Architects, and the Women in Design group always provides wonderful resources for women that I've used many times in my career, both as someone who provides and teaches others, and as a younger person who's actually taken advantage of the tutelage. So, but that doesn't mean I'd say I'd be the most woke person ever. And so I'm finding this period that we're in right now, I'm particularly sensitive to the challenges to women, and particularly women of color or of other groups that are new Americans, et cetera. I'm just recognizing all kinds of things that I was willing to play at as we kind of come up through the profession really need to be changed. And fortunately, I think people are talking about that and we're looking at it. But I'm a very strong feminist architect and an evolving one.
In some ways, it parallels the attention that embodied carbon is getting.
I think they're related. I really do, because it's, whose world is this, is the sort of question we all ask.
And what world do we want to see in the near future?
Yep, you're absolutely right. I mean, if there's a silver lining to COVID, I would say that is it, is this idea that we have all had time to pause and take a look at not only kind of how we got to where we are, but what is our near and longer term future. And I think that the environment has taken on a real social justice, mission's the wrong word, responsibility, that those of us who are in this field, it's more than just, doing kind of do no harm. It's more than just our own Hippocratic oath. It's actually this longer legacy that we're not only part of, but now actually have to write and kind of recorrect if we're at all have any hope of leaving anything behind. So I think they're absolutely married.
Yeah, and from my point of view, retrofits fit so well. I'm very excited about your work because retrofits is a topic I've been covering for 25 years now. And suddenly everybody's working, trying to figure out how to make retrofits, deeper energy retrofits, be cost effective and doable for more people. And it's really exciting.
It is really exciting. It's hugely inspiring. I think it's the reason why, and it's interesting because it's not just Passive House, but I am always surprised when I jump on one of your events to see 250 other people. And so I think that that is testimony to how important people feel that that the issue is, and that it's not just moving forward in kind of big new housing projects, but it's actually all of the other building fabric that has to have a carbon drawdown.
Yeah, what a good ending for our podcast today. Thank you so much, Katie, for talking to us, and good luck with your panel. Thanks. What you guys are doing, it's wonderful. I mean, it's just a great opportunity to participate in it. So I look forward to what's to come.
And that was Katie Faulkner there talking with Mary and Ilka back from episode 37, and some just fantastic topical ideas that are just gaining traction and interest. They certainly haven't faded. It's all really good stuff. We need more solutions for retrofitting to a higher standard. Mary, first of all, any things that you kind of still stand out, or any things that you sort of highlighted from re-listening to that episode?
Well, just the whole, her career, her experience that she brought to the new venture that she's in now with Placetailor is, it's great. It's like the right person at the right time. And, to me, it just feels so critical to get retrofits done at a faster pace, to scale up the getting retrofits completed, deep energy retrofits completed. And so having a company that's working on improving, to develop a retrofit panel to improve the scale of retrofits is really exciting. And they have such a great market there because so much of the housing is similar types. There's just a lot of what they call triple-decker housing. For those audience members who don't know what triple-decker is, it's three-story buildings that have pretty similar floor plans on each story.
Yeah. I was listening to our interview with Yale. I can't remember her.
Santo Pinto.
Santo Pinto, yes. Yeah. That was episode 33, and because they did some retrofit projects, the tower renewal projects, and in that they talked about this 200-year saving of embodied carbon. I'm not saying it very well, but basically, I think the length of time that it would take to recover in operational in carbon, the carbon that's already embedded in an existing structure is around 200 years. So her big point, Yale's point, was that it's always better to retrofit where you can, not just from a resources point of view, but they also found that it's cheaper, which is surprising for a lot of people because they think that it's going to be more expensive because it's more complicated. And I guess that's where solutions like Katie is developing with their panels come into play, because a big part of the challenge is finding products, materials that make and facilitate the retrofit process.
And especially a retrofit process where the occupants get to stay inside.
Yeah. That's a huge challenge. Huge challenge.
Yeah.
Did you have anything you wanted to add to any of that, Zach?
Yale's observation about those buildings makes so much sense, especially since a lot of these towers, and this is different from the triple deckers that are wood construction, but a lot of those towers are these massive concrete structures. So it becomes even more imperative. No, I think it's exciting, and I'm glad that that Katie's doing the work she's doing, and we need solutions that work in this space, and that's what's happening with what she's doing, and it didn't work out with Katerra. So I'm glad that she is able to, that she's taking that her smarts and entrepreneurial energy and able to apply it in the way that she's doing. It's really great stuff.
Yeah. I remember the first time around listening to this and having a look at all the stuff that Katie's involved with. And there's a few people in a similar boat where they seem to be doing so much stuff. And it points to people's passion, but also leadership in this area often looks a bit different from a traditional career where you just go and have one job. There are lots of people involved in this space that are professional architects, maybe for a part of the time, but they're also involved in teaching. They might be doing some research, and they might be then also doing some product development or selling or representing another brand. And it's I think becoming more and more common for people to have a few things going on that are all complementary, but it's sort of departing from a traditional 9-to-5 job when you just with one company and that's all you do. And yeah, Katie's definitely one of those leaders. Yeah. Yeah.
There are a couple of things happening in the world too that make this even more topical this week, and that's the IPCC report that just came out, outlining the certainty in the scientists' predictions about around the impacts of climate change and the urgency for us to do something about it. And we know that buildings are such a huge piece of that. And then also the fact that now at least in the United States, we're turning our attention to the budget reconciliation process in the Senate, where they're looking at the potential of a $3.5 trillion package that has the, knock on wood, has the real possibility of including major dollars for building retrofits and improvements. So
I think buildings definitely qualify as infrastructure.
Yeah, that's right. Well, in the infrastructure bill, right? The infrastructure bill looks like it's gonna happen. That's another $1 trillion. So hopefully we'll see some real movement, and it'll be people like Katie who are at the forefront of all that.
Just one of the important points on that is, of course, in the U.S., it's so important who's the president, and so this money will be flowing, but it also needs to flow to companies who are ready to move. on their ideas, which is great about PT Technologies, because, in 3 years we could have another administration on the horizon. So it's great that they're, ready to move forward with this new technology now.
Yeah, definitely. I just want to highlight as well the part of the group of podcasts that you did around this time, Mary, that was all to do with retrofits, and you published a retrofit magazine, which is still available, I think, on the Passive House Accelerator.
Oh yeah, for in perpetuity. Yes.
Yeah. So people should go and check that out. It's great work that you put that together, Mary. Some really awesome case studies and resources, lots of really great pictures. And of course, there were a whole bunch of videos that happened around that time as well. And they're also available. So lots of resources on the Passive House Accelerator that focus on this area of retrofitting to a passive house standard, some of the challenges, and also excitingly some of the solutions that are available now to do that. Where are things at? Is there any significant updates of where things are at with the panels now?
They've gotten initial funding. They're getting partnering up with several companies working on who's going to be producing the manufacturing equipment for their panels. They're going to working with various scanning technology companies to work out that end of the process. They are enlarging an advising group. An engineering company is helping them out also. So they're doing a lot of partnering up to take this concept take their product into the real world.
Cool. Yeah, things are happening. All right. And other things are happening out in the real world. Zach, you want to tell us about what's coming up?
They are. The real passive house world is going to be packed with events this fall. So on September 10th through 12th, there will be a hybrid, both in-person and online conference, the 25th International Passive House Conference of the Passive House Institute. And then that will be followed with an online-only installment on September 14th and 15th. So September will kick off with a bunch of Passive House Institute knowledge sharing and don't miss events. On September 22nd and 23rd, Passive House Canada will present the Tower Retrofit Symposium, which I'm sure will include Yael Santopinto's work and some great examples of transforming towers into passive house. On October 12th through 15th, FIAST will be presenting its conference, FIASCon, in Tarrytown, New York, and that also will have an online component. And November 25th through 27th, South Pacific Passive House Conference will be hosted by the Passive House Institute New Zealand, as well as Australia Passive House Association. And that's going to be hybrid as well, I believe. So there's the opportunities to be in person, learning about Passive House and connecting with colleagues, as well as online around the world.
Awesome. So much going on. Well, thank you, Mary, for joining us again today, and again for the initiating these conversations with the great women that you found throughout the year. It's been an awesome contribution and some really valuable insights into the passive house world. So thank you. Thank you to all the great listeners out there. We will have another Encore episode coming up next week. And after that, I think getting back into some great new content as well. So thank you all very much for listening in, and we'll be back again next week on the Passive House Podcast.